Hi guys, Dr. Martin Hart here. I'm very excited to announce the 4-part series called Exhausted, the Science of Sick and Tired. I know so many of my patients and so many of you out there suffer from fatigue, chronic fatigue, exhaustion. So I thought it would be great to cover this stuff so you guys could start to understand a little better and we could dive all the way into it. So how much easier would daily life be if you had more energy? How many of your symptoms would seem to decrease with less fatigue? We need energy to live and function, but how much do we really know about energy? You use it all the time, but do you really know how it gets created, how it gets used, how it gets signaled in the body? Most people don't. Most of your doctors maybe learned it in school, but they don't use it on a daily basis anymore to help you. So that's why I wanted to dive into this in a 4-part series so you can learn about it and you can figure out what you need to do to get the answers you need. So video 1 is going to be how energy is made. Okay. Video 2 is how do we signal and utilize that energy. Video 3 answers the question, what causes fatigue and energy leaks? And 4 is how do I get the answers I need? So how is energy made? Well, the definition of energy is the ability to do work. Every function internally and externally requires energy. So picking up a box off the floor or walking, that requires energy. But so does detoxifying, so does digesting your food, making your neurotransmitters. All of that requires energy as well. The thing is, people with fatigue understand this all too well. For fatigue sufferers, even the most mundane tasks can be exhausting. Writing, dialing the phone, just living. I mean, imagine that if just doing the functions internally takes so much energy, processing food, making neurotransmitters, rebuilding skin, etc., then just living can be exhausting. So if we understand that about energy, then let's look at how it's made. If our body's running like an economy, then energy is the money we use. And our currency as humans is ATP, okay? ATP is the money, the currency we're using. ATP is the energy we spend to keep the cells working. What is ATP? It stands for adenosine triphosphate. Basically what we have is there's a little molecule. We can kind of mimic it looking like that. A being our adenosine, our adenine, and it's attached to a little ribose, which some of you have heard of, which is a sugar molecule. Okay, and then there's 3 phosphate groups. 2 and 3, okay? So a couple of things really importantly. Number 1, having this, this ribose group here, this will be important later when we start to look at some of the energy leaks and what you can do about it, okay? But it's just important to know that inside an ATP is a ribose sugar group, okay? So the key, though, for the energy creation with ATP, it's these three bonds here with the phosphates, okay? So what happens when you have these 3 bonds, when we go to make energy, okay, they break one of those bonds. So one of those bonds is broken, like that, right? It's broken there. And then when that breaks, we get an energy burst, okay? So when you have that energy burst, your cells can function now, the enzymes can work, etc., okay? So when we think of things as fuels coming into our system, we think of food or other sources of energy, quote unquote, what those are, there's the building blocks for us to make ATP. Okay, ATP is really where the energy is at. And we get that energy by breaking apart those bonds in the phosphate groups. So as we make the energy, so we break down the bonds and then energy is created from ATP, you get ADP, which is 2 phosphate groups, adenosine diphosphate. And if you can't replenish it fast enough, you can break ADP down further to AMP, adenosine monophosphate, 1 phosphate group. The problem is that the further you break these groups down from ATP to ADP to AMP, then what happens is that's harder and harder for your body to recycle. It creates more and more of an energy debt that you have to recover from. So when we're going to recycle it or we're going to make this ATP, you can do it either with oxygen or without oxygen. When you create it with oxygen, it's called aerobic. When you call it without oxygen, it's called anaerobic. Okay, aerobic with oxygen, anaerobic without oxygen. So aerobic metabolism is the most efficient way to make ATP. It takes place mostly within our mitochondria, but it does generate free radicals and CO2, right? So we breathe in oxygen, it goes down, it makes energy for us in the mitochondria. They create CO2, we breathe it out, and the CO2 comes out. That's that exchange. So it does generate free radicals and CO2. So we need oxygen to make this cycle, to make the ATP. But there's three ways within this aerobic metabolism ATP generation that we can use. Number one is called glycolysis. Number two is the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle. And number three is beta oxidation. Okay, so let's go over each one of those three now. Okay, glycolysis. Glycolysis is basically the breaking apart, lysis, of glucose, glyco. Okay, so we break it apart and it turns into what's called pyruvate, which I'll explain more later. This process going from glucose to pyruvate, it generates 2 ATP molecules. That's helpful. It also prepares the glucose by turning it into pyruvate to go get shunted into the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, which you'll see more in just a second. One of the things that's important to know is you need magnesium for almost every single step within this pathway, okay? Magnesium makes all these function. So if you're short on magnesium, you're not going to be able to turn your glucose into pyruvate and make fuel from it. It's just going to sit there. That's why magnesium is great for diabetics, because it helps them use glucose for actual energy. The other cofactors are what's called NAD+ and potassium to make this work. Okay, so here we're at the Krebs cycle. Now the Krebs cycle is really where we started to put to work that pyruvate we made in the last cycle. Okay, so when glycolysis makes the glucose molecule into pyruvate, now the Krebs cycle is really where we'll put that to work. And I'll show you that here in just a second with a chart that we can use. Down, and I'm going to use this here to help us a little bit. So once you get this down so you get to glucose, it transforms down into pyruvate, okay? From pyruvate then, to enter the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle, it's got to turn into acetyl-CoA, and then it has to go around the cycle, okay? So let's explain that cycle now just a little bit. Okay, so the Krebs cycle, what it is, you can see it's like a wheel. It functions like a gear essentially. That's just a good way to explain it. So as it goes around, it's going to transform that acetyl-CoA into usable ATP molecules. Okay, it generates about 10 to 12 ATP each turn it makes. Now each turn, it's going to happen multiple times per glucose molecule. So in total, it could make 30 to 36 ATP per glucose molecule, which is very good. Now the thing to remember about the Krebs cycle, it will not function without oxygen. Once oxygen's not available inside that mitochondria or inside that cell, it stops. Boom. Okay, it locks up. Now the oxygen doesn't actually fuel this cycle itself. It fuels what's called the electron transport chain, which are these little cycles here. Okay, so those are what recycle our NAD for us. Now those are important because they generate ATP on their own, a couple ATP per cycle, but it's also important for cleaning up the free radicals and then continuing to make the energy here as you can see it. Okay, so that's the Krebs cycle. It uses magnesium as a cofactor, zinc, NAD, FAD, riboflavin, thiamine or B1 is really important for this cycle to work. So any of those cofactors you could be short in, those are important, okay, to make sure that you have plenty of. So let's head to the next slide. Okay, lastly, we have what's called beta oxidation. Beta oxidation is when instead of using glucose to start with, down glycolysis, we use fatty acids, okay? So these fatty acids via beta oxidation are turned into that acetyl-CoA that we just talked about, and then it can be used in the Krebs cycles. It also requires oxygen, requires water. So, you know, if you ever hear kind of some of the, like the pop physiology about drink more water to help you lose weight, well, you do technically need water in order to burn fat for fuel. So water will help you in that process. NAD and FAD, again, are also very important. On its own, going from fatty acids to acetyl-CoA, it will create 2 ATP molecules, and then it's another fuel source for us to create that additional 10 to 12 per cycle of ATP through that Krebs cycle, okay? So, you know, 10 to 12, 14 or so, depending on how much. Now, what's really interesting is one palmitic fatty acid, okay? It's just a type of fatty acid we can get in our fat cells. can create, when it goes through all these cycles, 106 ATP. That's a great source of energy, okay? Your fat cells inside your body are a great source of energy to generate. That's 106 ATP. Now let's contrast that back again. One glucose gets 30 to 36 ATP. So fatty acids are a great source of energy. Now that might lead you to ask questions about ketosis or ketogenic diets. Well, a ketone gets generated from fatty acids in the body via the cells, and then via beta oxidation, it's turned into acetyl-CoA, and then it goes through the Krebs cycle for us, okay? So via that, each ketone can produce about 22 to 24 ATP. It's still pretty efficient, okay? It's a good fuel source. It's a very clean fuel source for us. Ketones or fatty acids. So a great way to help generate excess, especially if you need to liberate some from fatty acids, or if you need to be a very anti-inflammatory aspect, a ketogenic diet to generate this energy is very good. But again, you need to make sure your body can do it. Can it convert from those ketones to acetyl-CoA, and can you make your Krebs cycle work? Those are things to look at if you've had problems getting enough energy on a ketogenic diet. Okay, so what if you don't have enough oxygen for whatever reason? You've got certain infections, you can't catch your breath, you're in high altitude region, you need energy fast. What do your body do? Well, that's called anaerobic, without oxygen, ATP creation. There's two main systems that we have for this. Number one is what's called the ATP Pcr system. Okay, what that stands for is you have the ATP here, and then it's replenished by something called phosphocreatine. Okay, so we talked about how those ATP, they have the 3 phosphate groups, right? And then we have to break one in order to make the energy, correct? Well, when that happens, if we need more energy quickly, like you're going to get up and rush to grab your kid before it runs in the street, before little Billy runs in the street, well, then you need that energy right now. So as you're burning that ATP to get there, it needs to replenish it quickly. So these phosphocreatine, they attach quickly to the ATP to quickly restore it for us so we're back there. But it doesn't last long, okay? Only up to about 12 seconds of activity, a short sprint, a quick set on exercise. It's very short, fast energy supply, okay? Burns out quickly. But one way you can improve this system, and this is why creatine supplements are often prescribed for people with chronic fatigue syndrome or for sports performance, they increase the phosphocreatine stores, so you get a little longer boost out of this. You can last a little longer with this system. It goes a little faster. Okay, another pathway that goes a little bit longer is called lactate glycolysis. Okay, lactate glycolysis is just like what we talked about before with glycolysis, going from glucose to pyruvate, but instead of going down through pyruvate and then into the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle, it turns into lactic acid because there's no oxygen to fuel that Krebs cycle. Okay, this lasts a little longer. It gets you about 30 seconds worth of energy at a time, but you get that burn in the muscles or that burn in the lungs. That's lactic acid building up, okay? It's a very inefficient system. Just like the other glycolysis, it creates 2 ATP, but it can't go into the Krebs cycle, so you don't get that extra 10 to 12 boost, and it creates lactic acid. Lactic acid is essentially like accumulating credit card debt, okay? The more of it you burn, the more money you have to make to pay it back. So the more energy, ATP, you have to create later on to replenish and break down that lactic acid, okay? So you create this energy debt. So a lot of chronic fatigue sufferers or exhausted folks understand that. Okay, I did something, I exhausted myself, and maybe I only did 3 hours of activity, but it takes me 18, 24 hours, 36 hours to recover because you went into debt to do that, okay? Now you have to pay back the debt just to get back up to where you were. So for as far as like short performance and stuff, yeah, of course we need this system, right? When we have to get a quick burst to go do a 30 seconds of activity, we need it, but we don't want to be running on this all the time. We need to recover. And so we'll talk about this later, but with chronic fatigue and fatigue symptoms, we have to do certain things in order to allow that recovery to happen, which we'll talk about. So this, I just want to take a moment to run through the lactate glycolysis picture here so you can see the chart. So we're coming down from glucose. There's, just to simplify, there's tons of enzyme steps in here, okay? I'm just not showing you. They're important, but you don't necessarily need to know them. So we come down, we get to pyruvate, and then instead of getting shunted here, which we need oxygen for, right? We need O2, we're going to lactic acid. So That's good in the short term. We don't want to run on it all the time because we create that lactate, that lactic acid buildup, and then we have to expend a bunch of energy to get it back to pyruvate. So once you actually have access to oxygen again and you have the appropriate byproducts and your system can recover, then it will use the citric acid cycle again down here, over here, to replenish this and clean this up. But in the meantime, it's a burden, it's a debt, okay? Now, the enzyme that some of you see on your blood work that does this is called lactate dehydrogenase. It's what helps recycle it. So if you have low lactate dehydrogenase, then we might assume you're going to have energy problems, okay? Because you're not going to be able to recover from this cycle very well. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is shifting energy systems. So I talked about how those are useful, right? The anaerobic systems are useful. So for short bursts of immediate energy, we need the anaerobic systems. But they do come at a cost, right? They create that lactic acid burn, they're inefficient, but they're useful. Sometimes, you know, to start a business or whatever, you have to take a loan out or go to college, you got to take a loan out or buy a house. That's useful as long as we can pay it back, okay? So that's what those systems are. They're useful. We just need to make sure we can pay them back. Aerobic ATP generation is more even-keeled, but it doesn't have those bursts of energy like we need. It's never going to give us that burst we need to get up and go do something. Or sometimes for people with fatigue, even just standing up is that get up and go that we need those acute systems for. But it is very, very efficient, okay? It supplies mild tasks. Like once you get up and go, once you're walking for a little while or working for a little while, it shifts over into these aerobic ATP generation systems, either fatty acids with the oxygen or glucose with the oxygen. But it doesn't generate it quickly for acute needs. All day long, you're shifting back and forth, and we need to have what's called metabolic flexibility. You need to be able to shift back and forth between these systems very well in order to have the energy you need for daily living, let alone thriving, okay? If you want to get to the point where you're going on long hikes again, things like that, then we need to allow this metabolic flexibility to occur. Okay, so in the long run, all of our energy systems require fatty acids, glucose, or oxygen, excuse me, because even if you're using that lactate system or the phosphocreatine system, we have to recover those systems. You can't survive lasting on only those systems, okay? Fatigue, by definition, is the absence or dysfunction of energy. It means you can't create ATP to break the bonds and get the energy you need, or you can't recycle it, okay? So if you're fatigued, the way I think of it is either you can't make or recycle the ATP, or you can't use it once you've made it. And so we need to look at those pathways to figure out what's causing your fatigue and what do we need to do about it. So I want to recap really quickly. We talked about what is energy, right? The energy is what gets created when we break those ATP bonds for our cells. And we talked about how ATP gets created either through aerobic means, the glycolysis, the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, and beta oxidation. We talked about how ketosis or ketogenic diets fit into that. We talked about the anaerobic system with the ATP Pcr. We talked a little about how phosphocreatine or creatine monohydrate supplements fit into that. And then we talked about the lactate glycolysis pathway and how lactic acid burn accumulates and the energy debt that gets created and how it gets repaid. And so this helps us to understand where fatigue may be coming from if we understand how it's created. And the one thing I really want to point out with that is when you're a truly systematic, holistic, functional medicine practitioner, and what we call at the clinic biological medicine, then it's most important to understand, number one, how does biology supposed to function before we worry about how it isn't functioning. Because if I know how it's supposed to function, I can start to uncover the reason why you're fatigued and then correct it versus just putting Band-Aids on. Okay, and so now you guys know more than quite a few practicing doctors out there, functional medicine practitioners who maybe forgot over the years how this functions and why we need to deal with it with fatigue. So now that you know how it's created, the next video I'm going to release here in a few days in the series is how do we use and signal that energy. Okay, you guys share this out so people can understand how they make energy. Like it, leave a comment if you would, and have a wonderful rest of your day.